My name is Elena Collins. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for more than a decade, I built my life inside one company. Not loudly, not dramatically. I wasn't the person whose name filled the room or whose opinions dominated every conversation. I was the person who made things work, quietly, consistently, without asking to be seen. People usually describe me as calm, thoughtful, dependable. At work, that translated into someone who could be trusted with sensitive details, unfinished systems, and problems no one else wanted to solve. Outside of work, it made it easy to underestimate. I didn't complain, I didn't posture, I didn't threaten to leave. And because of that, many assumed I never would. This story isn't about a sudden betrayal or a dramatic exit. There's no shouting match, no viral moment, no single villain. What happened unfolded slowly, almost invisibly over the years. It's about what happens when dedication is mistaken for obligation and when being professional slowly turns into being endlessly available. For a long time, I believed that giving more would eventually lead to being valued more. That if I stayed patient, stayed loyal, stayed reasonable, the balance would correct itself. I told myself that a career was about endurance, about sacrifice, about proving you could handle more than what was asked. What I didn't understand then was this. A career isn't about unconditional sacrifice. It's an exchange. And when that exchange becomes one-sided, the cost is rarely obvious at first. It shows up as small adjustments, slight disappointments, responsibilities that quietly stick to you while recognition floats elsewhere. In the next hour, I'm going to walk you through that journey, from who I was inside that company to the moment I realized I had slowly given away my leverage along with my best years. I'll talk about the subtle signs I ignored, the way silence can feel noble while it's actually erasing you, and how reclaiming your power doesn't require anger, revenge, or destruction, only awareness and timing. And I want to be clear about something. I didn't take anything that wasn't mine. I didn't sabotage anyone. I didn't burn bridges. What I did was stop overgiving. I chose myself without making a spectacle of it. And when the consequences arrived, they weren't dramatic. They were simply unavoidable. This is a documentary-style account. Honest, measured, unembellished. I'm not sharing it to make anyone look foolish, but to name something many people feel and rarely articulate. That being indispensable and invisible at the same time is not a coincidence. It's a pattern. If you've ever felt like your reliability became your cage, if you've ever been praised for your commitment while your boundaries quietly disappeared, if you've ever wondered whether staying silent was strength or just fear of rocking the boat, then you may recognize yourself somewhere in this story. I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm inviting you to listen, with curiosity, not judgment. So before we begin, let me ask you one gentle question. Have you ever realized that the version of you a company relied on was costing you more than you were willing to admit? Inside the company, I was known as solid. Not brilliant, not visionary, just solid. If something broke, it came to me. If a deadline was at risk, my name surfaced quietly in emails. If a process needed to be fixed, documented, or smoothed over so leadership wouldn't have to think about it again, I was the obvious choice. Not because I demanded that space, but because I never refused it. I wasn't invisible in the way people imagine invisibility. No one ignored me completely. I was acknowledged, nodded at, and thanked in passing. My name appeared in meeting notes. My work was referenced indirectly. This has already been handled, or we're covered here. I existed in the background hum of things functioning properly. And that was the role I played well. I showed up early. I stayed late without making a point of it. I remembered details other people forgot, passwords, dependencies, timelines that lived only in someone's head. Over time, I became a kind of organizational memory, not officially, not formally recognized, just relied upon. What I didn't notice at first was how rarely I was asked what I wanted. When new projects were assigned, the language was always gentle. "You're so good at this." When additional responsibilities appeared, they came framed as trust. "We know we can count on you." When promotions were discussed, the conversation stayed vague. "You're invaluable where you are." At the time, I took that as reassurance. I told myself this was what maturity looked like, being dependable without ego. I believed that real power didn't need to announce itself, that consistency would speak louder than self-promotion. I watched louder colleagues advance faster, and I didn't resent them. I assumed our paths were just different. But something subtle was happening. I was becoming defined not by my perspective, but by my availability. Not by my ideas, but by my tolerance. People didn't ask whether I should handle something. They asked whether I could. And because I usually could, the question stopped feeling like a choice. In meetings, I spoke when there were gaps. I clarified when things were confusing. I absorbed tension so others could move on. And slowly the room learned a pattern. Elena would catch what fell. That pattern didn't require appreciation, it required predictability. I don't say this with bitterness. At the time, I felt proud. Being needed felt like proof of worth. I mistook reliance for respect. I believed that if I kept things running smoothly, someone would eventually notice how much effort that took. But effort that prevents visible failure is easy to overlook. When nothing collapses, no one asks who held it up. What's strange is that no one ever explicitly told me to stay small. No one said, "Don't ask for more." No one said, "You don't deserve better." The message was quieter than that. It was embedded in patterns, expectations, and the absence of certain conversations. I was included, but not consulted. Trusted, but not championed. Essential, but replaceable in theory. Just never tested in practice. And I accepted that, because I believed being agreeable was professionalism, because I thought ambition, if expressed too clearly, would undermine my credibility, because I was afraid that naming my value would sound like entitlement. So I kept delivering, I kept absorbing, I kept smoothing things over. And the more I did, the more clearly my role was defined, not as someone who shaped outcomes, but as someone who ensured outcomes happened without friction. I didn't feel wronged. I felt settled, as if this were simply the natural ceiling for someone like me. Calm, quiet, useful. It took me a long time to understand this. Being seen as reliable is not the same as being seen as valuable. And being valuable is not the same as being protected. At that stage, I still believed my patience was an investment, that my silence was strength, that eventually someone would connect the dots. I didn't yet realize that to them, the dots were already perfectly connected, just not in my favor. The first moment didn't feel important when it happened. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't announce themselves as injuries. They pass as misunderstandings, timing issues, innocent oversights. For me, it happened during a quarterly review meeting. I had spent weeks preparing the operational framework for a cross-team project that leadership had been struggling to stabilize. It wasn't glamorous work. It involved aligning systems that didn't speak to each other, rewriting internal documentation, and quietly negotiating between departments that didn't trust one another. I did it carefully, methodically. I knew where the risks were because I was the one tracing them. When the meeting began, my manager walked the room through the plan. Not our plan, the plan. I listened as my work was explained clearly, confidently, almost word for word. The slides were familiar. The structure is unmistakable. But my name didn't appear. Not on the deck, not in the explanation, not even in passing. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. Credit wasn't why I did the work. The goal was alignment, not recognition. I stayed quiet, took notes, and nodded along like everyone else. Then something small happened. A senior leader asked a question, one that went directly to a decision I had made. My manager hesitated. Just briefly. Long enough for the room to feel it. I answered calmly, clarified the rationale, explained the contingency. The room moved on. No one acknowledged the moment. No one circled back to connect the dots. The meeting ended, people packed up, and the day continued exactly as before. Later that afternoon, my manager stopped by my desk and said, "Great job in there. Really saved us." Saved us. I smiled, said thank you, and that should have been the end of it. But it wasn't, because something about that exchange stayed with me. Not as anger, but as a quiet discomfort I couldn't quite place. It wasn't that I needed applause. It was that my contribution had only become visible when it filled a gap, and once the gap closed, so did the acknowledgement. That night, I replayed the moment in my head, not obsessively, just enough to notice the pattern forming. My work was trusted, my voice was useful, but my presence as a contributor was optional. I told myself I was overthinking it. The next few weeks reinforced that belief. Things went smoothly, the project stabilized, leadership praised the outcome. My manager received positive feedback. I was told again how dependable I was. But something had shifted internally. I started noticing how often my involvement was implied rather than stated, how often decisions relied on information I provided without inviting me into the decision-making space, how my role seemed to end at execution, even when the strategy leaned heavily on my insight. Still, I said nothing, because speaking up about something so subtle felt risky. How do you name an absence without sounding petty? How do you point out what didn't happen without undermining what did? So I rationalized it. I told myself that leadership visibility worked differently, that credit would come later, that my manager's success was tied to mine, even if it wasn't obvious yet. I reminded myself that I had security, respect, and stability. But once you notice the first small cut, it's hard to unsee it. I became more aware of how easily my silence was absorbed into the structure, how smoothly things moved when I filled in the cracks without asking to be acknowledged, and how little resistance there was to that arrangement. No one corrected the record. No one said, "Elena led this." They didn't need to. The system was working exactly as designed. That moment didn't make me angry. It made me attentive. I haven't changed my behavior yet. I didn't pull back. I didn't confront anyone. I simply started remembering things more clearly, tracking moments that previously would have blurred together. Because something inside me understood, before I was ready to admit it, that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a preview. After that first moment, nothing visibly changed. And that was precisely how the pattern took hold. Disrespect rarely arrives as a declaration. It settles in through repetition, through what becomes normal. And once something is normal, questioning it feels disruptive, even unreasonable. I continued doing my job the same way I always had. Thorough, careful, quiet. If anything, I became more precise, as if clarity could protect me. I told myself that consistency was the answer. If I removed all ambiguity, recognition would naturally follow. Instead, the opposite happened. Requests began bypassing formal channels and coming directly to me. "Can you just take a look at this? You'll know what to do. It'll be faster if Elena handles it." These weren't commands. They were compliments disguised as convenience. I absorbed them without protest. Meetings started being scheduled without me. Meetings where decisions were made that directly affected the work I would later be asked to execute. I'd find out afterward, usually through a forwarded email or a casual mention in the hallway. When I asked clarifying questions, no one seemed surprised that I wasn't already aware. It was assumed I'd adapt. And I did. I adjusted timelines, reworked plans, smoothed over contradictions between what had been decided and what was actually feasible. I protected other people's confidence by absorbing the friction quietly, the way I always had. The more I compensated, the less visible the cost became. I told myself this was just how organizations worked, that some people were thinkers, others were doers, that my strength lay in execution, not visibility. I watched colleagues with half my context speak confidently about initiatives I had stabilized behind the scenes, and I convinced myself that it didn't matter, because I was being useful. And usefulness is seductive. It feels like purpose. There were moments, small, sharp ones, when the imbalance surfaced clearly. A project I had effectively led would be introduced as collaborative. A decision I had warned against would fail, and I'd be asked to quietly fix it. A junior colleague would receive public praise for work I had heavily guided. Each time I felt a flicker of something. Not rage, not envy, just a tightening in my chest that I quickly dismissed. I didn't want to be seen as difficult. I didn't want to disrupt the harmony I'd helped create. I worried that pointing out these patterns would make me look insecure, or worse, ungrateful. So I normalized it. I told myself this was temporary, that leadership had a longer view than I did, that patience was part of professionalism. I reminded myself that I was paid well, respected, and trusted. But respect that doesn't translate into agency is fragile. What I didn't realize at the time was that my silence was doing more than preserving peace. It was training people, teaching them what I would tolerate, reinforcing the idea that my contributions didn't require acknowledgement to continue. The system learned quickly. My manager grew more comfortable presenting outcomes without attribution. Leadership grew accustomed to solutions appearing without needing to engage me directly. Colleagues learned that I would step in when things became complicated without asking questions that slowed them down. And I let it happen. Not because I was weak, but because I believed endurance was strength. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being constantly relied on but rarely considered. It's not burnout in the dramatic sense. It's quieter, heavier. A sense that your energy is being spent maintaining something that doesn't include you in its future. I started to feel that weight in small ways, a reluctance to volunteer ideas, a subtle withdrawal in meetings, a growing awareness that my career was advancing in workload, but not in scope. Still, I said nothing, because the disrespect was subtle enough to be denied, because there was no single moment I could point to and say, "This is wrong," because I had become complicit in my own erasure by calling it professionalism. Looking back now, I understand this clearly. Disrespect doesn't need cruelty to survive. It only needs your willingness to explain it away. At that stage, I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting anything. I was still loyal, still committed, still hoping that if I stayed steady, the imbalance would correct itself. I didn't yet understand that by normalizing the pattern, I was anchoring myself inside it. And the longer I stayed silent, the harder it became to imagine speaking at all. I didn't realize I had been assigned a role until I tried, quietly, to step outside of it. It happened during a planning cycle, one of those periods when teams reshuffle priorities and people begin signaling what they want next. I prepared carefully. I didn't demand anything. I didn't issue ultimatums. I simply expressed interest in leading a new initiative that aligned directly with the work I had already been doing. The response was polite, warm even. "Honestly, we were hoping you'd keep doing what you're doing," my manager said. "You're such a stabilizing force. We'd really struggle without you where you are." It was meant as a compliment. But something in that sentence landed differently. "We'd struggle without you where you are." Not, "we want to see you grow." Not, "you've earned a broader scope." Just, "stay." In that moment, the shape of my role became visible. I wasn't being prepared for something else. I was being preserved, exactly where I was most useful. I nodded, thanked them for the trust, said I understood, And on the surface, nothing changed. But internally, something shifted from confusion to clarity. Because for the first time, I saw the role I had been playing reflected back at me in explicit terms. I was the reliable one, the one who didn't rock the boat, the one who absorbed complexity so others could focus on visibility, the one whose ambition, if it existed at all, was assumed to be modest. It wasn't malicious. That's what made it harder to confront. No one was trying to hold me back. They simply had no incentive to move me forward. My presence solved too many problems. My silence made things easier. And I had helped create that dynamic. I thought back to all the times I had downplayed my aspirations, the times I had said, "I'm happy to help," instead of, "I want to lead," the times I had chosen harmony over clarity. I saw how each small decision had contributed to the story being told about me, a story where I was dependable but not directional, capable but not expansive, essential but static. That realization didn't hurt the way betrayal hurts. It felt colder than that, more factual. Roles, once assigned, are surprisingly difficult to escape, especially when you perform them well. People stop seeing you as a person with evolving goals and start seeing you as a function. And functions aren't asked what they want. I started noticing how often my role was invoked in conversations that didn't include me. Elena will handle it. That's Elena's area. She prefers working behind the scenes. That last one stung. I had never said that. But it was easier for others to believe than to ask me otherwise. Still, I didn't correct the narrative. Not yet. Part of me feared that if I challenged it, I'd lose the goodwill I had built. Another part of me wondered whether I had waited too long, that the role had solidified beyond adjustment. So I stayed. I continued performing. I fulfilled the expectations attached to me, even as I became increasingly aware of how narrow they were. But awareness changes things. Once you see the role clearly, you can't unsee it. Every interaction begins to confirm it. Every assumption reinforces it. And every day you remain inside it becomes a choice, not an accident. At that stage, I still believed the right move might be to speak up more, to advocate, to explain. I hadn't yet understood that the system wasn't misunderstanding me. It understood me perfectly. The shift didn't happen during a meeting. It didn't happen in a confrontation. No one raised their voice. No one crossed a line. It happened on an ordinary afternoon in the middle of a task I had done dozens of times before. I was reviewing a process document, one I had originally built from scratch years earlier and updated repeatedly as the company evolved. It had become one of those quiet backbones no one talked about, but everyone relied on. I was making a routine adjustment when I noticed something strange. My name wasn't anywhere on it anymore. At some point, without discussion, without intention, it had been rewritten, reformatted, sanitized. The structure was the same. The logic is intact, but any trace of authorship had disappeared. Not just mine, anyone's. It had become the company's process. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. It wasn't about credit. I had never signed my work. I had never needed my name on things to feel legitimate. But in that moment, something clicked with uncomfortable clarity. If I left tomorrow, this would stay. If I burned out, this would remain. If I was replaced, this would be handed over as if it had always existed this way. I realized then how thoroughly I had worked myself out of visibility, and instead of feeling angry, I felt calm. That calm scared me more than anger would have, because anger still hopes to be heard. Calm means you've stopped expecting recognition. I closed the document and leaned back in my chair. The office around me hummed as usual. Keyboards clicking, muted conversations, the low, steady rhythm of people moving through their days. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. For the first time, I didn't ask myself how to fix the situation. I asked myself what staying would cost. I thought about how long I had been deferring my own growth in the name of stability, how often I had accepted "not now" as an answer, how I had shaped my identity around being needed rather than being fulfilled. And I understood something quietly devastating. The system didn't need me as a person, it needed me as a function. Functions are replaceable. Even if the replacement struggles, the function remains. That realization didn't make me want to leave immediately. It made me want to stop bleeding invisibly. So I did something very small. I stopped explaining things preemptively. When questions came, I answered them, accurately, professionally, but I didn't fill in gaps that hadn't been asked about. I didn't anticipate every need. I didn't smooth over confusion before it surfaced. It wasn't passive-aggressive. It wasn't punishment. It was a restraint. I wanted to see what would happen if I stopped compensating. The effect was subtle at first. People hesitated more. Meetings ran slightly longer. Clarifications had to be requested instead of assumed. Nothing broke, but things slowed. And for the first time, the cost of my constant presence became visible. That day marked a quiet line I didn't announce crossing. I didn't tell anyone I was changing. I didn't give a speech or make a declaration. I simply adjusted my internal posture. I stopped treating my endurance as a moral obligation. I began paying attention, not to how I was perceived, but to how I was positioned, to where information flowed, to those who were protected from consequences, to those who absorbed them. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was internal, but it was irreversible. Because once you see clearly that your loyalty is being leveraged rather than reciprocated, you can't return to unconscious giving. I didn't know yet what I would do with that clarity. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't strategizing an exit, but I had stopped assuming that silence was the same thing as strength. And that changed how I moved through everything that followed. Before that shift, my silence had been reflexive, automatic, a habit shaped by years of smoothing things over and staying agreeable. After that day, it became intentional. That distinction mattered more than I expected. I didn't suddenly become outspoken. I didn't start challenging decisions in meetings or correcting people publicly. From the outside, I looked exactly the same, calm, cooperative, reliable. But internally, my silence had changed its meaning. I was no longer quiet because I assumed things would resolve themselves. I was quiet because I was observing. I started noticing how often people mistook my lack of reaction for agreement, how decisions were made quickly when I didn't raise questions, decisions that later unraveled. I noticed how frequently I had been acting as an invisible buffer between leadership and reality. So I stopped buffering. When timelines were unrealistic, I let that tension exist long enough for others to feel it. When assumptions were flawed, I waited to be asked before correcting them. When responsibilities were casually placed on me without discussion, I asked clarifying questions instead of absorbing them automatically. None of this was confrontational. It was measured, polite, almost indistinguishable from my usual demeanor. And that's what made it effective. People began to misread the shift. Some assumed I was tired. Others thought I was distracted. A few interpreted my restraint as disengagement. No one imagined it was deliberate, because they had grown accustomed to me filling in the blanks. In meetings, pauses stretched longer. When someone said, "Elena will handle that," I replied, "Let's define scope first." When information was missing, I didn't rush to supply it unless it was my responsibility. I wasn't withholding knowledge. I was respecting boundaries, ones I had previously ignored. What surprised me was how quickly that subtle change altered the dynamic. My input, when offered, carried more weight, not because it was louder, but because it was rarer. The questions I asked slowed conversations down. My silence created space where assumptions used to pass unchallenged. And still, no one addressed it directly. That was another lesson. People often prefer interpreting change as temporary discomfort rather than acknowledging it as a boundary. It allows them to hope things will return to normal without adjusting their behavior. I let them hope. Meanwhile, I started documenting, not emotionally, factually. I kept notes on decisions I was excluded from, responsibilities I absorbed without recognition, and processes that depended heavily on my involvement. I tracked patterns, not incidents. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was building clarity for myself. Because clarity is power when you've been operating on goodwill alone. The more I observed, the more obvious the structure became. I saw how certain people were shielded from accountability, how risk flowed downward while credit flowed upward, how my role had been carefully shaped to absorb complexity without influencing direction. And I understood something critical. My silence had been part of what made this structure stable, so I recalibrated it. I chose when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to ask questions that reframed conversations instead of answering them. I let small inefficiencies surface rather than erasing them instantly. Nothing exploded, nothing collapsed, but things stopped running quite so smoothly. And for the first time, that smoothness, or lack of it, wasn't entirely my responsibility. I still did my job well. I didn't withdraw effort or act resentful. I simply stopped performing emotional labor that had never been acknowledged as labor. That distinction freed up something inside me. Not anger, not bitterness, just space. Space to think about what I wanted next. Space to notice opportunities I had been too busy to see. Space to imagine a future that didn't rely on my willingness to stay quiet. Silence, when chosen, is not weakness, it's positioning. And without announcing it, I had begun to reposition myself. While things appeared mostly unchanged on the surface, something fundamental was happening underneath, and no one noticed. That wasn't an accident. For years, my visibility had been tied to output. As long as things worked, my presence faded into the background. Now, as I became more selective with my effort and more intentional with my silence, that same pattern worked in my favor. No one looks closely at what they assume will always be there. I used that assumption carefully. I began mapping the organization the way I should have years earlier, not by title or org chart, but by dependency. Who relied on which systems? Where information is bottlenecked? Which processes existed only because I maintained them? I wasn't hoarding knowledge. I was acknowledging where it lived. I realized how much of the company's operational continuity depended on undocumented judgment calls. Decisions I made instinctively because I had been there long enough to understand the context. Things that were never written down because I was always available to explain them. So I stopped being immediately available. I didn't disappear. I didn't refuse help. I simply allowed questions to wait until they were formally asked. I encouraged people to submit requests in writing. I redirected casual hallway conversations to scheduled check-ins. This did two things. First, it exposed how much had been resting on informal access to me. Second, it created a paper trail where none had existed before. Again, this wasn't aggressive. It was procedural, professional, the kind of behavior no one could reasonably object to. At the same time, I started learning quietly. I deepened my understanding of the systems I managed, not just how they worked, but how they interfaced with legal, financial, and compliance structures. I asked neutral questions, read internal policies more closely, paid attention to who approved what and why. What I discovered wasn't scandalous. It was structural. Certain safeguards existed only on paper. Certain processes depended heavily on trust rather than verification. And certain risks had been quietly accepted because they had never caused visible harm, because I had been absorbing them. I also noticed how much institutional memory lived in me, not in documents, not in shared drives, in conversations, in context, in knowing why something was done a certain way and what would break if it changed. That kind of knowledge doesn't announce itself. It only becomes obvious when it's gone. No one noticed that I was cataloging it. I kept documenting dependencies, not for leverage yet, but for understanding. I wanted to know what would happen if I stepped back. What would slow? What would fail gracefully? What would require intervention? The picture became clearer with each week. I wasn't indispensable in a heroic sense. The company would survive without me, but the cost of my absence would be higher than anyone realized and not immediately visible. Delays, confusion, rework, decisions made without historical context. Not a crisis, a drag. And that kind of drag doesn't inspire panic. It inspires frustration. I also began quietly preparing myself. I updated my resume, not aggressively, not publicly, just enough to remind myself of the full scope of what I had done. I reframed my experience not as tasks completed, but as systems stabilized, risks mitigated, outcomes protected. That reframing mattered, because for years I had internalized the company's version of my role. Narrow, supportive, static. Now I was seeing it differently. As adaptive, strategic, foundational. I didn't tell anyone about this shift. Why would I? They were still comfortable, still assuming continuity, still interpreting my calm as compliance. Meanwhile, I was building something quietly. Optionality. Optionality is the most underappreciated form of power in a workplace. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't demand. It simply exists, waiting for the right moment to be exercised. I wasn't planning a dramatic exit. I wasn't plotting a confrontation. I was preparing to no longer need the approval I had been chasing unconsciously for years. And the irony is this: the more prepared I became to leave, the clearer my value became. To myself. They never noticed the preparation because it didn't look like a rebellion. It looked like business as usual. That was the advantage of being underestimated for so long. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no email, no discovery, no moment where someone else suddenly realized what I had. It happened privately, between me and the facts I could no longer ignore. By that point, I had been observing for months, watching how requests moved, how approvals stalled, how often my input was quietly required to resolve issues that leadership didn't fully understand. I had also been reviewing documentation, what existed, what didn't, and what people thought existed. That's when the shape of the leverage became clear. It wasn't a single system or file. It wasn't a password or a secret. It was continuity. The invisible glue between decisions, processes, and consequences. I realized that a large portion of the company's operational stability relied on judgment calls that were never written down, because they lived in me. Not because I was special, but because I had been present long enough to accumulate context and careful enough to apply it quietly. If I left abruptly, nothing would immediately collapse. That was the illusion everyone lived under. But within weeks, small failures would start to appear. Not catastrophic, just persistent. Teams would make reasonable decisions without historical context and wonder why the results didn't align. Processes would technically function, but inefficiently. Mistakes would be repeated because no one remembered why certain paths had been abandoned, and no one would be able to point to a single cause. That was the moment of clarity. Leverage doesn't always look like control. Sometimes it looks like absence. What surprised me wasn't the realization itself. It was my reaction to it. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel excited. I felt sober. Because leverage carries responsibility, and I knew exactly how it could be abused. I had no interest in punishing anyone. I didn't want the company to fail. I wasn't trying to teach them a lesson. That kind of thinking felt cheap and temporary. What I wanted was alignment. I wanted the exchange to finally reflect reality. For the first time, I understood that staying without boundaries was a choice, and leaving without preparation would only repeat the same pattern elsewhere. So I refined the leverage, not by hiding information, but by clarifying ownership. I began formalizing processes I had previously managed informally, not all of them, just enough to make visible how much had been flowing through me. I documented decisions at a high level without capturing every nuance. I stopped translating between departments unless it was explicitly part of my role, and I paid close attention to how the organization responded. There was confusion, but not urgency, mild frustration, but no alarm, exactly as I had predicted, because systems rarely recognize their dependencies until they're strained. At the same time, I received external interest. Quiet messages, exploratory conversations, nothing concrete yet, but enough to confirm that my skills were transferable, my experience relevant. That mattered more than any offer. It meant I was no longer trapped by loyalty alone. The private reveal wasn't about discovering my worth. I had always known I was competent. It was about understanding how my competence had been absorbed into a structure that didn't need to acknowledge it to benefit from it. And once you see that clearly, you stop negotiating with hope. You negotiate with facts. I didn't rush. I didn't announce anything. I gave myself time to sit with the reality of what I had learned, to consider the consequences of action and inaction. Because leverage doesn't force you to move. It gives you the ability to choose when you do. By the end of that period, one thing was undeniable. I could stay and continue being essential but contained. Or I could change the terms, knowing that doing so would disrupt a balance others were comfortable with. That was the decision waiting ahead of me. But before I made it, I needed to be certain of one thing. Not whether the company deserved my loyalty, but whether I deserved better than conditional respect. The hardest part wasn't deciding what to do. It was accepting what each option would cost me. By the time I reached that point, I could see the paths clearly. They were no longer abstract or emotional. They were practical, measurable, and mutually exclusive. I could stay. Staying would mean stability, familiar systems, predictable rhythms. It would mean continuing to be relied on, needed, and quietly praised. It would also mean accepting that my role had a ceiling and that the ceiling wasn't temporary. If I stayed, nothing terrible would happen. That was the danger. I would continue to be essential but unseen, trusted but not advanced. My leverage would remain unused, slowly dissolving as people adapted just enough to survive without changing the structure. Staying would cost me time, and time was the one thing I couldn't replace. I could confront. I could request a formal conversation, present my contributions, ask for recognition, scope, and authority. I could explain, calmly, professionally, how much I had been carrying and what I expected in return. I knew how that would go. There would be a surprise, polite discomfort, reassurance, maybe even temporary concessions. But the underlying structure wouldn't change because it had never been designed with my growth in mind. Confrontation would turn my quiet awareness into negotiation, and negotiation requires the other side to want change as much as you do. They didn't. And then there was the third option, the one I hadn't allowed myself to fully consider until that moment. I could leave. Not dramatically, not impulsively, not as an act of protest, as a strategic decision. Leaving would mean uncertainty, new systems, new relationships. The risk of repeating old patterns if I wasn't careful. It would mean letting go of the identity I had built, the dependable one, the stabilizer, the constant. But it would also mean reclaiming authorship over my time. That was the irreversible part. Once you choose yourself in a system that benefits from your silence, there's no way to undo that choice without betraying yourself again. I didn't make the decision in one night. I gave it weeks. I watched how I felt each morning, whether the thought of staying felt like commitment or like inertia. whether imagining leaving brought fear or relief. The answer was consistent. Fear was loud. Relief was quiet, but steady. I realized something important during that time. I wasn't afraid of leaving the company. I was afraid of leaving the version of myself that had been needed. That version had been my armor for years. Without it, who would I be? The decision point wasn't about loyalty, it was about alignment. A career isn't about unconditional sacrifice, it's about mutual investment. And when one side stops investing, staying loyal doesn't make you noble. It makes you complicit in your own diminishment. So I decided I wouldn't threaten, I wouldn't bargain, I wouldn't explain myself prematurely. I would move forward quietly with intention, not to punish, not to prove anything, but to step into a future where my value didn't depend on my willingness to disappear. Once that decision was settled, something unexpected happened. I felt calm, not excited, not triumphant, just grounded. Because clarity removes urgency. When you know what you're going to do, you stop reacting to every moment as if it's decisive. From that point on, everything I did was informed by one truth. I was no longer staying by default, and that changed the meaning of every step that followed. Once the decision was made, urgency disappeared. That surprised me. I had always assumed that choosing to leave would feel dramatic, that it would come with adrenaline, anxiety, or at least a sense of rebellion. Instead, it felt methodical, almost administrative, because when you're no longer negotiating with hope, you don't rush, you prepare. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning, not my manager, not colleagues I trusted, not even people outside the company. This wasn't secrecy born from fear, it was clarity protecting itself. I started by aligning the practical details. I reviewed my finances with a level of attention I hadn't given them in years. I calculated how long I could comfortably go without income. I adjusted spending quietly, not drastically, just enough to buy myself time if I needed it. Time was the real asset. I also reviewed my employment contract carefully, not to look for loopholes, but to understand boundaries. What I owed, what the company owed me, what I was allowed to do, and what I wasn't, before and after leaving. Everything I did stayed well within those lines. At work, I continued performing my role competently. I didn't disengage. I didn't create problems. But I stopped absorbing risk that wasn't explicitly mine. I redirected responsibility back to its owners. I documented decisions and confirmations with calm precision. If something was unclear, I asked for it in writing. If a request exceeded scope, I clarified priorities. If assumptions were made, I asked who had approved them. Each action was reasonable, professional, unremarkable. But collectively, they changed the texture of my presence. I also began transferring knowledge selectively, not as a favor, but as part of a formal process. I scheduled handover sessions when appropriate. I documented core workflows at a level that matched my role, not the hidden labor I had been doing for years. That distinction mattered. I wasn't sabotaging continuity, I was restoring accuracy. People began noticing small delays. Questions that used to be answered instantly now require coordination. Decisions moved more slowly without my informal guidance smoothing them out. Still, no one panicked. Why would they? I was still there. Externally, I moved just as quietly. I had conversations with recruiters and contacts, not with desperation, but with discernment. I asked better questions than I ever had before. About decision-making authority, about expectations around availability, about how contributions were recognized. I wasn't looking for prestige, I was looking for alignment. The difference was profound. Opportunities that once would have flattered me now felt wrong. Roles that mirrored my old pattern revealed themselves quickly. And a few conversations, rare ones, stood out precisely because they didn't rush me. Those were the ones I paid attention to. Throughout all of this, no one at work suspected anything. They interpreted my steadiness as loyalty. My calm is contentment. My continued performance is a commitment. They had been trained over the years to read me that way, and I let them. Because moving in silence isn't about deception, it's about not explaining yourself to people who haven't asked what you need. By the time the pieces were in place, financially, professionally, mentally, I felt prepared. Not certain, not fearless, prepared. And preparation does something subtle to power dynamics. It removes your dependence on immediate outcomes. At that point, whether the company recognized my value or not no longer determined my next step. Their response had become informational, not decisive. I hadn't left yet, but I was no longer staying. That difference would soon become visible, not because I announced it, but because systems always feel the shift before people do. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They began as small disruptions, subtle enough to be dismissed, frequent enough to be felt. At first, there was confusion. People started asking questions they hadn't needed to ask before, not because the information was new, but because the shortcuts they relied on were gone. I noticed it in the tone of emails, more tentative, less certain. Meetings ran longer, follow-ups multiplied. Nothing was broken, but nothing flowed the way it used to. And because I was still present, the discomfort didn't have a clear source. That's the strange thing about quiet labor. When it disappears gradually, people don't realize what they're missing. They just feel the friction. A project stalled because two teams interpreted a process differently. Normally, I would have noticed the misalignment early and intervened quietly. This time I waited. Not out of spite, but because it wasn't mine to correct unless asked. When the issue surfaced weeks later, it was treated as an unfortunate oversight. No one traced it back to the missing connective work. They couldn't, because they had never known it existed. Another time, a decision was made without historical context. A system was adjusted in a way that technically made sense, but reintroduced an old risk that had taken months to resolve years earlier. When the issue reappeared, there was confusion, frustration, meetings to understand what went wrong. I watched calmly, not with satisfaction, with recognition. This was what it looked like when institutional memory went unconsulted. Still, no one connected the dots. Instead, there was a subtle emotional shift around me. People became more cautious in their requests, more formal. Some stopped assuming I would automatically take things on. Others checked in more frequently, sensing something had changed but not knowing how to name it. I was still helpful, still professional. But I no longer absorbed uncertainty on their behalf. That was the difference. Leadership began asking broader questions about efficiency, about resourcing, about why things felt harder lately. The answers circled around process, communication, and coordination. No one mentioned me. And that, too, was expected. Because when a system depends on invisible work, its absence is experienced as general dysfunction, not personal loss. The company didn't feel betrayed. It felt slowed. And slowing is unsettling. Deadlines that had once been met comfortably now required extensions. Work that had felt seamless now required explanation. Small mistakes accumulated, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to create irritation. I noticed how often people said, "This used to be easier." They just couldn't say why. What struck me most was this. No one accused me of changing. No one confronted me. No one asked if something was wrong. Because from their perspective, I was still doing my job. The extra layer, the invisible labor, had always been optional in their minds. They simply hadn't realized how much they had come to rely on it. This wasn't punishment. It was exposure. The consequences weren't dramatic. They were structural. And as they accumulated, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because things were faltering, but because I was no longer silently responsible for holding them together. The weight I had carried for years was finally being redistributed, whether the organization recognized it or not. I hadn't caused the strain, I had stopped preventing it. And that distinction mattered, because for the first time the cost of my quiet dominance, my constant regulation, my invisible corrections, was no longer being paid by me alone. The system was beginning to feel it. By the time the concern became explicit, the window to fix things had already closed. It started with meetings about process improvement, then resource optimization. Then there were quiet conversations about knowledge gaps. The language was careful, non-accusatory, framed as collective responsibility, but underneath it, there was a growing sense of urgency. Leadership had noticed the drag. What they hadn't noticed was when it began. They brought in consultants, briefly, reviewed workflows, suggested tools, created task forces. Everything looked reasonable on paper. None of it addressed the real issue, because the issue wasn't missing documentation, it was missing context. Context doesn't transfer easily once it's no longer embodied. I was invited into more conversations again, asked to clarify things I had once managed automatically. People listened more closely when I spoke, took notes, followed up. The irony wasn't lost on me. My value was becoming visible precisely because I was no longer giving it freely. Still, I didn't step back into my old role. Not because I wanted things to fail, but because stepping back would have reset the pattern without changing the structure. I would have become the solution again rather than the signal. And I knew better now. There were moments when it would have been easy to stay. When someone said, "We really need you here," with sincerity. When leadership acknowledged how much institutional knowledge I carried. When offers were hinted at, more influence, more voice, eventually. Eventually. But eventual recognition after years of quiet extraction isn't a gift. It's a delay. The system wasn't offering change, it was offering comfort. And comfort would have cost me the clarity I had earned. I could feel the organization trying to course correct, without confronting the deeper truth that it had been built on unreciprocated labor, that fixing the symptoms without addressing the pattern would only postpone the same outcome. By the time conversations turned more direct, what would it take for you to stay? The question was no longer relevant. Not because the answer was unreasonable, but because it was late. Trust, once eroded quietly, doesn't regenerate on demand. I had already accepted another role by then, not publicly, not officially announced. But in my mind, the decision was complete, and that changed how I heard those conversations. They sounded urgent, they sounded like regret, they sounded like a desire to restore what had been convenient, not like a vision for something new. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt detached, because I understood something they didn't. You can't fix a system by asking the person it overlooked to save it again. By the time they realized how much they had relied on my unspoken contributions, the only version of me they could see was the one who had already chosen to leave. Not angrily, not loudly, just decisively. It wasn't that they didn't care, it was too late. The conversation happened in a small conference room on a quiet afternoon. No raised voices, no tension thick enough to cut. Just two people sitting across from each other, finally naming what had been avoided for years. My manager spoke first. They said they were surprised, that they hadn't realized how dissatisfied I had been, that they wished I had said something sooner. I listened carefully, because that sentence, "I wish you had said something," carried more weight than they intended. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I let the silence settle long enough for the room to feel honest. Then I said, calmly, "I did, just not loudly." I reminded them of the times I had asked for a broader scope, of the responsibilities I had absorbed without authority, of the moments I had flagged risk quietly, only to be asked to resolve it rather than address it structurally. I didn't list grievances. I described patterns. They nodded, took notes, looked genuinely reflective. That was new. They told me I was valued. The company had underestimated how much I carried, that there were things they could offer now, changes they were willing to make. I believed their sincerity. And still, I declined. Not because the offers were insufficient, but because they were reactive. I explained that I had already accepted another position, that my decision wasn't driven by anger or disappointment, but by alignment, that I needed to step into a role where my contributions were visible by design, not by exception. The room stayed quiet. There was no argument, no attempt to guilt me, just a moment of realization, one that couldn't be undone. They asked if there was anything they could do differently in the future. That question mattered, so I answered it honestly. I said, "Listen, earlier, pay attention to who is making things look easy. And don't wait until someone is ready to leave to ask what they need." They thanked me, and that was it. No emotional explosion, no dramatic closure, just a clean acknowledgement of what had been missed. As I left the room, I felt something settle. Not triumph, not sadness, but completion. Because confrontation doesn't require heat to be effective. It requires clarity. And clarity doesn't seek validation. I didn't reinvent myself after I left. That's the part people often expect, but it isn't true. I didn't become louder. I didn't suddenly chase titles or visibility. I didn't trade one version of overextension for another with a different name. What changed wasn't my personality, it was my positioning. In my new role, the expectations were explicit. Scope was defined. Authority matched responsibility. When decisions were made, the people accountable were in the room. Not because the culture was perfect, but because the structure required it. That difference was subtle, but profound. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying context alone. Knowledge lived in systems, not just in me. When something went wrong, it was examined collectively instead of quietly rerouted. And because of that, my calm felt lighter. I noticed how much energy I had been spending managing invisibility, how much cognitive load had gone into anticipating needs, smoothing friction, and preventing outcomes no one would thank me for avoiding. Without that burden, I didn't need to prove anything. I worked well. I spoke when it mattered. I rested when I needed to. That balance wasn't a reward. It was a boundary. What surprised me most was how little resentment I carried with me. I had expected anger to surface once the distance set in. It didn't. Because clarity dissolves resentment. I could see my past clearly now, not as a story of exploitation, but as a story of misalignment. A system doing what it was designed to do. A person giving more than the system required because no one had asked her to stop, including herself. I stayed in touch with a few former colleagues. Some told me things had changed. Others said they were still trying to figure out what had gone wrong. I listened without commentary. It wasn't my role anymore. The version of me who needed to be understood had stayed behind with the role I left. Now I measure success differently. Not by how indispensable I felt, but by how sustainable my work was. Not by how much I absorbed, but by how clearly responsibility was shared. Quiet dominance, I've learned, isn't about control. It's about self-respect expressed consistently. I didn't take anything from the company when I left. I took myself back. And that was enough. Looking back now, I don't see those years as wasted. I see them as instructive. I learned how systems really work, not the way they're described in mission statements, but the way they operate under pressure. I learned how easily dedication can be absorbed without being acknowledged, And I learned how silence, when misunderstood, can become a form of unpaid labor. Most importantly, I learned this. A career isn't about unconditional sacrifice. That belief is often dressed up as professionalism, as loyalty, as maturity, but in reality, a career is an exchange. Time, skill, and attention are traded for growth, respect, and agency. When that exchange becomes unbalanced, staying longer doesn't make it fair. It just makes the imbalance quieter. There's a story we tell people like me. Be patient. Don't make noise. Your time will come. Sometimes it doesn't. Not because you aren't good enough, but because the system has no reason to change as long as you keep compensating for it. Quiet dominance doesn't mean overpowering anyone. It doesn't require revenge, humiliation, or exposure. It looks like noticing patterns early. It looks like choosing restraint over reaction. It looks like preparing yourself so you're not forced to choose between dignity and security. I didn't leave to prove a point. I left because staying would have required me to keep disappearing, and I refuse to do that anymore. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. If your reliability is being used as a reason to limit you, it's no longer a compliment. Pay attention to where your energy goes. Notice who benefits when you stay quiet, and ask yourself, not angrily, not defensively, but honestly, is this an exchange or a slow withdrawal? I'm not telling you to leave your job. I'm not telling you to confront anyone. I'm not telling you to burn bridges. I'm inviting you to see clearly, because clarity changes how you move. And once you move differently, the system around you has no choice but to respond, one way or another. So I'll end with this question, and I genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. Have you ever realized that the thing you were praised for most at work was the same thing that kept you from being fully seen? Thank you for listening.